The cold hit Dorothea first, not the kind that settles into your coat and stays polite, but the kind that comes off the Wyoming plains like something personal, like the land itself has decided you don't belong here and wants you to know it. She stood at the edge of the Holt Creek Depot platform with a carpet bag that held everything she owned, and a letter she'd read so many times the fold lines had gone soft. The letter was from a man named Garrett Vane, rancher, widower, father of one, who had answered her advertisement in the Omaha Matrimonial Gazette with 4 sentences and a money order for train fare. The 4 sentences said, "I have a ranch. It needs managing. I have a daughter, 7 years old. I am not an easy man." Dorothea had written back with 3 sentences of her own. She had worked her father's dry goods store in Missouri from the time she could make change. She was not looking for easy. She would arrive on the 14th. What the letter hadn't said was that the ranch was 40 miles from the nearest town, over a road that was more suggestion than fact, or that November in Wyoming came at you sideways, or that the man waiting at the end of the platform would look at her like she was a problem he hadn't yet decided whether to solve. Garrett Vane was tall in the way of men who've spent years doing hard work outdoors, not built for show, built for endurance. His coat was good quality and badly maintained. His hat was pulled low against the wind. He stood apart from the 2 other men waiting on the platform, not because he was unfriendly exactly, but because he seemed to take up space differently than other people, like he'd decided long ago that proximity required permission. He didn't wave when she stepped off the train. He just watched her walk toward him, measuring something she couldn't name. "Miss Alderton," he said, "not a question, Mr. Vane." She offered her hand. He shook it once, firm, and let go. "Wagons out front. We've got daylight for another 2 hours, and I'd rather not make the last 10 miles in the dark if we can help it." That was all. He picked up her carpetbag before she could reach for it. Not gallantly, just efficiently, and walked. Dorothea followed, deciding that 4 sentences in a letter had been an accurate representation of the man. The wagon ride was cold and quiet. Garrett drove with the focused economy of someone who had done this exact thing several hundred times and saw no reason to make it more interesting. Dorothea watched the landscape open up around them, grassland rolling into foothills, the sky enormous and pale and indifferent. It was nothing like Missouri. Missouri had edges, tree lines, the sense of things contained. This felt like being set down in the middle of something that had no intention of ending. She'd left Missouri with $32, a character reference from the town minister, and the specific understanding that there was nothing left for her there. Her father had died in the spring. The store had debts she hadn't known about. Poker debts, as it turned out, signed in back rooms she'd never been invited into. The bank had been patient for 4 months and then had not been patient at all. By August, she was boarding with a neighbor, doing laundry for money, and facing the arithmetic of a future that didn't work no matter how she arranged the numbers. The matrimonial advertisement had felt like the last door in a hallway where all the other doors had already closed. She was still deciding whether she'd made the right choice when they crested a low rise, and the Vane Ranch came into view below them. It wasn't what she'd expected. The house was smaller than she'd imagined. 2 stories, log and stone, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front. But what struck her first was the state of it. The fence around the kitchen garden was listing badly. One of the outbuilding doors hung crooked on its hinges. The barn looked solid, but the pasture fencing beyond it had been patched so many times in so many different ways that it looked like something assembled from whatever happened to be nearby. This place is struggling, Dorothea thought. She filed the observation away without judgment. Struggling, she understood. A child appeared on the porch before they'd pulled all the way up. Small, dark-haired, regarding them with the particular solemnity of a 7-year-old who has learned that new things in her world don't always improve it. This was Lena Vane, who Dorothea would later learn had her mother's eyes and her father's talent for silence. "Papa," the girl said, watching Dorothea with open assessment. "Lena." Garrett climbed down from the wagon and lifted the girl briefly, set her down. "This is Miss Alderton. She'll be staying." Lena looked at Dorothea for a long moment. "Do you cook?" "I do. Papa burns things, Lena." Garrett's voice was mild but final. "It's true." Dorothea bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. "I'll try not to burn things," she said seriously. The girl considered this, then nodded, as if terms had been agreed upon. Inside, the house was clean in the way of places maintained by someone who values function over appearance. No curtains on the kitchen windows. No pictures on the walls except one. A small portrait hung near the stairs of a woman with Lena's eyes, younger than Dorothea had expected, caught mid-law in the way portraits rarely managed. She didn't ask about it. Some questions answered themselves in time. The older ranch hand, a weathered man named Burl, who had been with the ranch since before Garrett's time, showed her around the kitchen and the storage rooms, with the thoroughness of someone who'd been doing two people's jobs and was quietly desperate for that to stop. He explained the stove's temperament. It ran hot on the left side. The draft had to be adjusted before the fire would draw properly, and showed her where the preserves were kept and apologized, without much hope for the state of the root cellar. Garrett didn't come inside again until supper. He ate what she put in front of him, without comment, which she was beginning to understand was his version of approval. Lena talked enough for both of them, asking Dorothea specific and occasionally inconvenient questions about where she'd come from, whether she'd ever seen a mountain lion, and whether she thought it was fair that 7-year-olds had to go to bed before the sky was fully dark. I think sleep keeps people from being unreasonable the next day, Dorothea said. Lena thought about this. Does Papa sleep enough? Garrett didn't look up from his plate. Bed, he said. After the girl had gone upstairs, Dorothea cleaned up the supper things in silence, while Garrett sat at the table with the ranch ledger, making the kind of careful notes that suggested he already knew the numbers didn't work, and was documenting that fact with precision. I'd like to understand the accounts, Dorothea said. If I'm going to manage the household well, I need to know what I'm working with. He looked up. Something in his expression shifted. Not suspicion, but recalibration, like she'd answered a question he hadn't yet asked. Father ran a store, she said. I kept his books from the time I was 12. He slid the ledger across the table without a word. She sat down and read it. It took about 20 minutes to see the shape of the problem. The ranch was not bankrupt, but it was moving in that direction with the unhurried certainty of something that doesn't know it should be worried. Cattle prices had dropped 2 years running. A bad spring had cost them calves. One of the hired men had left and hadn't been replaced because there wasn't money to replace him. Burl was doing 3 men's work and was 62 years old. The north pasture, she said. You're running cattle on it, but the fence repairs alone last year cost more than the beef brought in. Garrett's jaw tightened slightly. I know. So you're carrying that pasture out of something else? Yes. What would it cost to close it for a season, let the fence go, and rotate that herd south? He was quiet for a moment, less than keeping it open. Then why? It was my father's first pasture. He ran his first herd there, he said it plainly without expecting sympathy. Just fact. Dorothea looked at him across the ledger. She understood that. She understood exactly that. She'd stayed 2 months longer in her father's store than any rational accounting of her situation warranted, moving between shelves that still smelled like him, straightening inventory that no one was going to buy. I'm not telling you to sell it, she said, just to rest it. Something in Garrett's face shifted very slightly. He reached across the table and took the ledger back. He didn't say anything. But that night she heard him at the kitchen table, long after she'd gone to bed, and in the morning she found a new column in the ledger in his handwriting, labeled with the name of the South Pasture and a series of numbers that meant he'd been working out the rotation in his head. He hadn't thanked her, but he'd done the math. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Dorothea found she could keep. She was up before the sun, stove going, coffee strong enough to do actual work. She made breakfast for Garrett and Burl, and the one remaining hired hand, a young man named Theo who was earnest about cattle and hopeless about conversation. Then there was the housework, which in a working ranch meant something more than sweeping. Mending clothes that got destroyed at a rate she hadn't anticipated. Preserving what she could from the kitchen garden before the freeze took it. Learning which supplies were worth ordering and which were cheaper to make. And there was Lena. The girl was not difficult exactly. She was watchful in the way of children who have had to be, who have learned that adults come and go and that attachments have a cost. She let Dorothea teach her things, how to make biscuits that weren't weapons, how to mend a hem that would actually hold, how to do the kind of arithmetic her father would need her to know. But she kept a careful distance that Dorothea recognized without taking it personally. She'd needed time to trust, too, once. The moment she understood Lena's particular loneliness came on a Tuesday afternoon in December, when Dorothea was doing the mending and the girl came in from school and sat at the kitchen table without being asked and opened her reader without speaking. She sat there for an hour and a half while Dorothea worked, not talking, not needing anything, just present, like she wanted company without having to ask for it. Dorothea kept mending, didn't try to fill the silence, just let it be enough. After that, Lena came to the kitchen most afternoons. Garrett noticed. He didn't say anything, but she caught him watching once from the doorway. Girl and woman at the table, lamp lit, quiet, and something in his expression was unguarded enough that she looked away, giving him privacy for whatever it was. She was figuring out that he carried his grief the way some people carried injury, careful not to put weight on it in front of others. But you could see it in how he moved if you paid attention. It was Burl who told her about the wife one morning in early January when he was helping her bring in firewood and had apparently reached his limit of not mentioning it. Her name was May, he said. Fever, 2 winters back. Came fast and went fast. 3 days. He stacked wood with the deliberate attention of someone who needs something to do with his hands. He held the ranch together after. For Lena mostly, but you can see it's worn him through. He blames himself, Dorothea said. It wasn't a question. Burl looked at her sideways. He wasn't here when it started. He'd gone to Cheyenne for supplies. Got back and she was already past helping. A man like that. He stopped. He's got it in his head that if he'd been here, something would have been different, even though it wouldn't. Dorothea thought about that for a long time. She didn't try to address it directly. You couldn't address that kind of grief directly. You could only give it room and time, and the evidence that the world still worked even through the weight of it. Winter tightened around the ranch through January and February. The work changed character. Less riding, more indoor repair, more hauling, more breaking ice from the water troughs in temperatures that made your face hurt. They were snowed in for a week in late January, all of them together in the house, which forced a kind of proximity that the daily routine had kept at bay. Lena taught Burl a card game. Burl told stories about driving cattle before the railroads changed everything. Theo, who hadn't spoken more than 10 consecutive words since Dorothea arrived, turned out to know an extraordinary number of folk songs, and was, without warning, willing to sing them. And Garrett, on the third night when the wind had been howling for 2 days and they'd all run out of ways to be separately occupied, sat down at the table while Dorothea was reading and said, unprompted, "What did you actually leave behind? In Missouri?" She looked at him over her book. Not much. A person doesn't answer an advertisement like that if there's something to stay for. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her since she arrived. She set the book down. My father died in April. He'd been borrowing against the store to cover debts I didn't know about. When the bank called them in, there was nothing. She said it straightforwardly, without looking for sympathy. I had $32 and a character reference and a set of skills that weren't worth much in a town that already had all the seamstresses it needed. Garrett was quiet for a moment. That's a hard position. It was a clear position, Dorothea said. Hard and clear aren't always different things. His mouth shifted very slightly at the corner. She was learning that this was the closest thing he had to a smile in the early stages of finding something worth smiling about. My father's first hired man used to say that, he said. Except about cattle, smart man, he was. He looked at the fire. He died the same winter as May, different reasons. It was a bad winter. I'm sorry, old grief, he said, and she recognized the phrasing for what it was, something he'd said before, a way of acknowledging something without drowning in it. It's mine to carry. She thought about what Burl had told her, about the guilt Garrett had been living inside for 2 years, and she wanted to say something to it. Instead, she said, "You carry it well." He looked at her. "I carry it because the alternative is setting it down where Lena can see it." That got through something in Dorothea that she hadn't expected. She looked back at her book so he wouldn't see it on her face. They sat by the fire for another hour, not saying much, and it was the most at ease she'd felt since she'd arrived. March came with mud and with trouble, which in her experience usually arrived together. His name was Porter Walsh, and she'd never seen him before in her life. But Garrett went very still when the wagon appeared on the north road, and Walsh climbed down from it. Walsh was a broad man, not fat but built dense, with the kind of smile that arrived ahead of its actual meaning. He shook Garrett's hand without waiting to be invited to, and looked around the ranch with the particular attention of someone who is calculating. "Heard you had a hard couple of winters," Walsh said. "Most people did," Garrett said. Sure. Still. Walsh's eyes moved to the house, to the barn, to Dorothea where she was standing on the porch. "I've been buying up some operations in the territory, consolidating. It's the smart play right now with prices where they are. And I know you've got good land here, Vane, good water especially. That creek doesn't run dry in August like half the properties out here." "The land's not for sale," Garrett said. "Everything's for sale if the price is right, not this." Walsh smiled, unconcerned. "Think on it. I'll be back through next month." He got back in the wagon. As he turned it, he looked at Dorothea directly for the first time. "Nice to see you keeping better company these days, Vane," he said and drove off. Garrett stood watching the road after the wagon disappeared. When he finally turned, his jaw was tight. "You know him," Dorothea said. "I know what he is. He came up the porch steps. He bought the Kinsey Ranch 2 years ago for a third of what it was worth. Old man Kinsey had one bad season and Walsh had the note on his credit. 6 months later, the bank called it. He looked out at the north pasture. He's been watching this place. Does he hold any of your paper?" Garrett looked at her. "No, but he'd like to." She understood the rest without being told. One bad season, the wrong creditor. and Holt Creek Ranch went the way of the Kinsey operation. And right now the numbers were running close enough to that edge that a man like Walsh could afford to be patient. All right, Dorothea said. Then we make sure he doesn't get a reason to stop being patient. Garrett looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize. He wasn't calculating anymore. He was seeing her, specifically the way people do when someone says something that matches exactly the shape of a thought they'd been carrying alone. The accounts, he said. Yes, and the spring contracts. Who are you selling to this year? Hammond in Cheyenne. What's his current rate? He told her. She did the arithmetic in her head and her expression must have shown it, because he said, I know. There's a buyer in Laramie, she said carefully. My father used to get letters from a cattleman there. They were buying from Missouri suppliers because the Wyoming ranchers wouldn't deal with them. Something about not knowing someone personally. But their prices? You know who? I'd have to write some letters. It might take a few weeks. He was quiet. Then, write the letters. The following weeks were the most uncertain of her time at the ranch. Not because of the work. She'd found her footing in the work, but because of what was shifting between her and Garrett in the spaces around it. They were finding each other with the careful attention of people who have both been burned before and moved deliberately as a result. He started leaving the ledger on the table for her without being asked. She started checking with him before making changes to the household budget, not because she had to, but because she'd noticed it mattered to him that decisions were shared. Lena started calling her Thea, which nobody had ever called her, and which she didn't correct. And one evening in early April, when the snow was finally pulling back from the valley floor and the first tentative green was showing in the low places, Garrett said, from where he was fixing a chair near the fire, I don't know how to do this. She'd been mending. She didn't look up immediately. Do what? This. A pause. Whatever this is. She set the mending down, looked at him. He was looking at the chair, not at her, in the way he did when he was saying something that cost him. May and I grew up together, he said. I'd known her since she was 9 years old. There was never a time when I had to. He stopped. Started again. I don't know the first thing about beginning. Dorothea thought about what to say for a moment. I don't think there's a first thing, she said finally. I think you just keep doing what you've been doing. He looked at her. You show up, she said. You do the work. You pay attention. She held his gaze. You've been doing all three since I got here. The quiet that followed was different from the quiets they'd had before. Warmer somehow. More honest. He didn't say anything else that night. But in the morning, when she came down to start the stove, there was a small bunch of early wildflowers on the kitchen table. The kind that grew in the south meadow, blue and stubborn, the first ones to come up after snow. No note, no explanation. She put them in a jar with water and didn't mention it. He noticed the jar on the windowsill at breakfast and said nothing, but the tight line of his shoulders eased a fraction, and she understood that this was how they would do this. Carefully, honestly, without performance. It might have stayed that quiet, that incremental, if Porter Walsh hadn't come back in May with more men and a different kind of smile. There were 3 riders with him this time. They came on a Thursday morning when Garrett was in the far pasture and Burl was at the barn, and only Dorothea and Lena were at the house. Dorothea sent Lena upstairs with instructions to stay there and went to the porch herself. Mr. Walsh, she said. Ma'am. Walsh tipped his hat. Vane around? He'll be back shortly. You're welcome to wait at the gate. Walsh smiled. I think we'll just wait here if it's all the same. He looked around the yard with the same measuring quality he'd had before, but something was different now. Less patient. I've been giving some thought to my conversation with Vane. Prices dropped another 15% last month. Lot of ranchers in a hard position right now. The ones who move early? Mr. Vane has already given you his answer, Dorothea said. Walsh's eyes came back to her. The smile stayed, but the quality behind it shifted. And you'd speak for him? On this, yes. Interesting. Walsh moved his horse a step closer to the porch, and the men with him spread out slightly in that practiced, lazy way that was meant to be noticed. You know, there are a few ways this plays out. Man holds on to what he's got too long. Prices keep falling. He finds himself owing more than he can service. Creditors get nervous. Things get called in. Mr. Vane doesn't carry debt he can't service, Dorothea said. And I'd be careful about suggesting otherwise where other people might hear it. That kind of talk about a man's finances has a way of becoming its own problem. Something moved in Walsh's expression that wasn't the smile. He was recalculating, looking at her with a different kind of attention. Garrett's voice came from behind the barn. He must have come back by the east field, seen the horses. He walked across the yard with that deliberate economy of movement, not hurrying, but arriving with a weight that the situation changed around. Walsh Vane, Walsh paused. The lady was keeping me company. She was telling you to leave. Garrett stopped a few yards from the horses. He was not wearing his gun, but Walsh's men were, and the air had the particular quality of something that could go several ways. The answer is what it was in March. If that changes, I'll send word. Until then, you're not welcome on this property. Walsh looked between them. Whatever calculation he'd been running, he reached its end and didn't like the result. You're making a harder road for yourself, he said without particular heat. That's my road. Walsh turned his horse. The men with him did the same. As they rode out, the last man looked back with the specific quality of someone making a note. Lena appeared at the upstairs window when the sound of hooves had faded. Are they gone? They're gone, Dorothea said. Garrett was looking at her. You held that? I was on the porch when they arrived, she said. It seemed like the thing to do. Something shifted in his expression that she hadn't seen there before. Not the almost smile. Something quieter and more certain. Thank you, he said. He said it like he meant it specifically, not as formality. She held his gaze for a moment. You'd have done the same. Not as well, he said simply, and went to see about the horses. Walsh didn't come back that month, but the worry he'd left behind was harder to move out. Dorothea watched Garrett work the numbers again, watched him make the same calculations she'd been making and arrive at the same answer. They were all right for now, but now had a limited duration. One more bad season. One significant expense. The margins were real, but they were thin. The letters she'd written to the Laramie buyer came back with a reply in June. Interested? Willing to negotiate on price? Could they receive a small shipment in late summer as a trial? She showed Garrett the letter at supper. He read it twice. Then he set it down and said, How did you know to write to them? I didn't, she said. I wrote to several buyers. They were the ones who wrote back. He looked at the letter again, then at her. Dorothea. She waited. I'd like. He stopped. In the months she'd known him, she'd learned to wait through his silences. They weren't avoidance. They were him getting to what he actually meant. I wrote to a minister in Laramie last month about making this arrangement permanent. Legal, I mean. He said it straightforwardly, without flourish. I should have asked first. That was backwards. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was low between them, and outside the summer dark was full of the sound of frogs from the creek. Lena was asleep upstairs. The ranch was quiet in the specific way it got quiet after a long working day, everything settled and done. Is that what you want? She asked. Yes. No hesitation. Is it what you want? She thought about the woman she'd been 8 months ago on a platform in Omaha, $32 and a character reference, and a door at the end of a hallway where all the other doors had closed. She thought about the day she'd arrived at this scraped bare, difficult, struggling, beautiful piece of land, and understood in her bones that it was trying, just like she was trying. She thought about Lena at the kitchen table, asking for nothing, just company, and Garrett's handwriting in the new ledger column, and wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, with no explanation needed. Yes, she said. The wedding was small because they were both people who found large things uncomfortable, and because Holt Creek in late June had 100 other demands on everyone's time. The minister from Laramie came up on a Wednesday. Burl and Theo stood as witnesses. Lena wore her good dress and stood next to her father with the solemnity of someone who understood this was important and had decided to approve. When the minister asked Garrett for his vows, he said the formal words first, correctly, because he did things right even when they were difficult. Then he stopped, looked at Dorothea, and added, I will not stand between you and your own judgment. I will try to deserve the trust that you've given me here, and I will make sure you never regret coming. It was not a speech, it was a promise. She understood the difference. She said, I will stay because I choose to, every day that I stay, and I choose to. Burl looked away, which for a man of his generation was the equivalent of weeping. Lena took Dorothea's hand on the walk back to the house. The summer trial shipment to Laramie went well enough that the buyer contracted for a full delivery in the fall, at a price that changed the ledger in ways Dorothea took real satisfaction in. They hired a second hand. They fixed the outbuilding door. The fence around the north pasture, the one Garrett had decided to rest for a season, got repaired in the fall when the cattle came off it, on their own terms, without Walsh's money and without Walsh's timeline. Porter Walsh sent a letter in August that was politely worded and meant nothing. Garrett showed it to Dorothea, and she read it and said, He's moving on to easier operations. Garrett nodded. They didn't discuss it further. The night before the fall drive, Dorothea sat on the porch in the last of the evening light and watched the valley settle into dusk, the mountains going dark at their edges, the creek catching the last of the color out of the sky. She heard the door open behind her, and Garrett came out and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. We'll be gone 4 days, he said. I know. Lena and I have plans. He looked at her sideways. She could see the question. We're going to sort out the storage room, she said. and she wants to try making pie. And I told her she could stay up past full dark on Saturday if she wanted, since you won't be here to regulate it. The corner of his mouth moved. She asked you for that. She negotiated for it. She's quite good. She gets it from her mother, he said quietly. Not sad exactly. Something more settled than sad. I know, Dorothea said. I've noticed. They stood together in the cooling evening. The ranch around them was proof of something, not just work, but the specific kind of work that accumulates into a life. The fence lines they'd fixed, the ledger they'd balanced together, the kitchen table where a girl came every afternoon for the specific comfort of not being alone. I wasn't sure this was going to work, Garrett said. Not an apology, just honesty, which she'd come to understand was the only way he knew how to say things. Neither was I. She looked at him. I wasn't sure I was going to work. He turned to face her. You were the one who made it work. We made it work, she said. That's what people who trust each other do. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to keep doing this badly, you know. The personal things. The words. He looked somewhere between rueful and serious. I'm not going to become someone who's good at them. I know, she said. You leave wildflowers on the kitchen table. I read the language. He looked at her in the last of the light, and what was in his face was so unguarded that she held it carefully. The way you hold something that matters. Good, he said finally, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly right. Years later, when Lena was grown and the ranch had expanded twice, and the north pasture Garrett's father had first run cattle on was thriving again with a new fence that would outlast all of them, Dorothea would sometimes stand in the kitchen in the early morning. The stove going, coffee working, the house just beginning to wake around her, and think about the version of herself who had stood on that Omaha platform with $32 and a door that had finally closed. She'd been certain then that she was starting from nothing. What she understood now was that she'd been wrong. She hadn't been starting from nothing. She'd been starting from herself. Her father's arithmetic in her hands, her own stubbornness in her spine, the specific capacity she'd always had for walking into hard situations and finding the work worth doing. The ranch had needed that. Garrett had needed it. Lena had needed it. But she had needed it too, the proof that what she brought with her was worth something. Not because someone said so. Because she could see it in the ledger, in the repaired fence, in a small girl who came to the kitchen table every afternoon for the quiet company of a woman who had learned to make herself at home in difficult places. She heard Garrett on the stairs, heard him pause in the doorway the way he always did, that brief moment before he moved into the room, as if he still sometimes could hardly believe this was his life to walk into. She didn't turn around, just said, "Coffee's ready." He came in, poured 2 cups, set one beside her at the counter without a word. Outside, the Wyoming morning was doing what Wyoming mornings did, arriving with indifference to human preference, cold and wide, and so indescribably itself that it made your chest feel too small to hold the view. She'd hated it that first November. She'd found it lonely and outsized and nothing like Missouri. Now she looked at it every morning and thought, mine, not because anyone had given it to her, because she had earned the right to stand on it. That was the thing they never told you about starting over. They talked about it like loss, like diminishment, like a last resort. Nobody mentioned that sometimes the door that closes is the one that needed closing, and the hallway beyond it leads somewhere you would never have thought to look for on your own. Nobody mentioned that the life you build from what you have left can turn out to be more yours than the life you left behind, because you made every choice in it, clear-eyed and without illusion, knowing exactly what you were doing. Dorothea had been sold in the Omaha Matrimonial Gazette for train fare and 4 sentences. She had arrived, and then she had built something that was entirely, irreversibly hers.